Welcome to Emerging Technology Horizons. I'm Mark Lewis, the Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. And with me today is Ms. Sara Carioscia, who is a early career scientist, a PhD student at Hopkins University, working in the Cell Molecular Development Biology and Biophysics program. Sara is also a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow, which is a really big deal. It's a extraordinarily prestigious fellowship. But she's got an extensive background in STEM, even at this early point in her career, has an extensive background in STEM, particularly as it relates to the Department of Defense. Earlier in her career, Sara was one of my colleagues at the Institute for Defense Analyses and worked on a variety of technology studies, including some that were particularly relevant to the Department of Defense. Among the various projects she worked on were things related to space, everything from export controls to looking at venture capital investments in space technology. She worked on projects related to biology, dual use research of concern, looked at database privacy issues in genomics, and also we worked together on a project looking at supersonic aircraft, looking at the new trends in commercial supersonic aircraft. But I'll also point out that Sara was a researcher who worked on a document known as Air Force 2030. And that was an effort that was initiated by Secretary of the Air Force Heather Wilson and was executed by then Air Force Chief Scientist Richard Joseph to look at essentially an overhaul of the way the United States Air Force does its science and technology enterprise. A number of recommendations came out of that study. One of the other principals on that study was the current Chief Scientist of the Air Force, Victoria Coleman. And it looked at how the Air Force manages innovation and how it can link the activities of the lab more closely to the Air Force, but also keep a longer-term view on its technology horizon. Sara has an undergraduate degree from Georgetown University with majors in biology and classical studies. And among the fun facts, she can actually read hieroglyphics, which she once taught to me. So, Sara, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, for having me here. I've enjoyed listening to it so far, so I'm very excited to be a guest and talk to you today.
So we have an audience of at least two, you and my mother.
Yes.
So that's good. That's good to know.
Soon to be my mother also.
Okay, there you go. So we're up to three. No, actually, we've been getting some really good feedback on not audio feedback, listener feedback on the podcast so far. So thank you so much. So hey, I want to start off. Take us through your path to a career in STEM. We talk a lot about the importance of getting the brightest young minds in our nation working on the problems of interest to us in science technology. Tell us a little bit about your path. How did you wind up where you are?
Sometimes I feel like a lot of things were just a happy accident, but when I was applying to colleges, I knew I wanted to study science just because I enjoyed my science classes in high school. And then when I got to Georgetown, the biology major was really appealing because there were opportunities to do research in the labs. And I think part of it was just that I understood the biology research a little bit more just because I had taken more biology classes before. But I worked in a lab throughout my undergraduate career, my time at Georgetown, and from all those experiences, I actually took a science policy class one year and learned how basic science transitions into applied science, transitions into technologies and defense strategies and things like that. And I thought that would be a really good way to have an impact in my career. And when I finished undergrad, I was absolutely sure I did not want to do a PhD. I thought grad school seemed like a bit of a drag. So I applied to a few jobs, and I ended up working with Dr. Lewis at the Institute for Defense Analyses Science and Technology Policy Institute, and there, I did the science policy research that Dr. Lewis walked us through at the beginning. From meeting people who were scientists, I thought, okay, even more impact than policy. I think I miss being the one doing the research, doing the hypothesis-driven questioning, trying to figure out how, from a basic research perspective, I could have my work be influential and be impactful downstream. So in my second year at STIPI, I just applied to some graduate programs. It ended up shaking out very well. I'm really happy at Hopkins. My lab looks at human genomics, a very exciting field right now. I'm thrilled to be working there because we have so much data, and we are able to read papers from not that long ago and say that, oh, we can answer that question that was kind of unanswerable in my lifetime because, we have full human genome sequences, just lots of efforts from researchers and a lot of efforts in the tech development space. Plus biology, as you all know, is one of the R&D priorities in the Department of Defense and across the government. Big ideas of the NSF include, life sciences and computationally intensive research. So my lab, the lab I'm part of at Hopkins, is all computational research. We have genomic sequence data from a variety of sources, and we're looking for, patterns, ways to influence genes, ways that genes influence populations, and variation across it in humans. And a lot of those lessons are applicable outside of humans. I think one of the coolest things about working in human genomics is that you can't do it experimentally.
Well, yeah. Can't do it ethically experimentally.
We don't do it experimentally.
Yeah,
Some
we don't do it.
may
That's right.
do it.
That's
we
right.
don't do it.
Yeah.
And so you really have to out-innovate those restrictions with computational methods and approaches and statistics and see what you can see those ways. So I think it's a very interesting challenge. Of course, I joked around with my advisor a few weeks ago, like any third thing in biology that someone mentions to me, I'm like, oh, that is so cool. So I get it. But yeah, human genomics is for sure near the top of that list for me.
So obviously, it was part of the biotechnology, emerging technologies that the Pentagon is really focused on, and for all the great applications, but also concerns of how it could be misused, as you alluded to. So I'm glad you're thinking about that as you progress. I love the fact that you point out that it was some early science experiences, laboratory experiences as when you were an undergraduate that helped get you directed on the career path that you're following. Also, I really admire you got a diversity of experiences, everything from biology to supersonic airplanes. And yet you didn't stick with supersonic airplanes. You went back to biology.
It was hard not to.
That's okay. Yeah, I know. I can imagine. So as you look forward, obviously, early career scientist doing research in a cutting edge area. I've got a friend who likes to say that biology used to be the course that the folks who couldn't make it in engineering would go. Now it's where all the cool kids go because of all the exciting opportunities in biology. What do you envision? Where do you see the field going? What excites you about computational biology, and what are some of the applications?
I think one of the coolest things is actually a project that just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago. It's called the telomere to telomere consortium. So a telomere is the very end of the chromosome on either ends, and the chromosome is just the whole stretch of DNA. Humans have 23. It varies across species, but the human genome sequence was kind of sparse. There were gaps in it, and this whole group of people, a lot of folks at Hopkins, 3 folks in my lab that I got to follow their work very closely, had worked for the last couple of years on filling in all those gaps. And that's a huge deal because once you have, a reliable reference genome from humans that has every position in the human genome filled in, you can do, studies on variation across populations, within populations, and you can kind of see more clearly what makes things tick. People think that the next step, I think, is going to be the pangenome, which is like a reference that takes into account different populations, which I think will also be really helpful because one of the areas that I think is a little bit lacking, I think a lot of folks think is a little bit lacking, is that a genome is only as useful as the population that it was made from. So studies, based on a genome from a certain population, the findings from that won't be applicable to populations that are too different from it. So any sort of like precision medicine or all those things that are based on very, very specific changes in the genome won't be as widely applicable. So a pangenome, and there are a few other like ongoing projects that are trying to help address that, I think will make healthcare much more useful from a genomics perspective, but also more equitable across populations.
So more personalized healthcare. Perhaps.
More personalized, and also just like a clearer view of how populations differ at the genetic basis and what sort of interventions can be taken. Not all of it is intervention, I'm like a basic research nerd, so I love thinking about the applications, and I do in my career hope to move away from basic towards more applied research. But for right now, I'm like thrilled to be just looking for like very fundamental variation within and between humans.
Okay, so now let me go a bit dark, because there's a flip side. We would always worry about, you could imagine a a less than ethical operator getting a hold of data like that.
Yeah. Well, did you read?
You know,
I'm sure
yeah.
it was like a big story a few weeks ago that like one of the pregnancy tests, not tests for pregnancy, but one of the diagnostic tests they do during pregnancy, that was in a ton of countries and has this huge genomic data set, was run by, I think, one of those not to be named actors. And so they now have the largest, like, of women of that age group genomic database, which is totally scary.
Yeah, yeah. We so one of the things that, you know, when I was in the department, we were concerned about was a company with connections to a foreign government that was actively trying to get, you know, it was trying to get DNA profiles of DoD personnel, and you know, we would speculate. So if you had that available, you had that database, maybe you pick out what are the characteristics that make for a particularly effective soldier, right? And then you start targeting attacks at that.
Oh yeah, it can totally unveil,
Yeah.
you know, population-wide vulnerabilities and how to target certain people within things or keep some people protected from those sorts of attacks.
Yeah, really kind of scary stuff.
Then there's also the whole like identifiable data situation, which is a bit of a different view of the same, you know, large database risk category, but the idea that the data is supposed to be unidentifiable, but a lot of researchers have shown that regular biologists, like no crazy technology, nothing crazy, just PhD researchers are able to re-identify all these people in these data sets, and that's also not good.
Yes, exactly. You think it's anonymized, but there are ways.
Well, if they say it's anonymized, it probably isn't.
Yeah, I know. So if we think about, you know, I think about some of the other biotechnology applications. You know, it's a very broad area. Everything, you know, microorganisms that could produce jet fuels or manufacture, you know, structural materials, condense rare earth elements, concentrate rare earth elements. Do you see that in our future once we have a better understanding of the genetic code?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the dark side of all this is that a better understanding for good, the better understanding is still there for bad. I think that advancements in biology are going to be necessary for things, and it's like as basic now we think as basic, I guess, as GMOs, all the way up to what you're saying. But it's kind of a tricky line because it also depends on who's doing that research, and you want that research to be done by folks who, you know, have to sign 12 things saying they're not going to share it outside whatever, and it's risky to have like international pipelines sometimes, I think, but on the flip side, the best collaborations happen from, you know, diverse groups of people. There's a lot of evidence of that, so keeping information safe once you have it, you can't control the applications, right? It's kind of like once it's there, it's there.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. We've always argued that one of the great advantages the United States has is this group of friends, partners, and allies that we work with, collaborate with, interact with. I point out that if you look at, you know, U.S. investments, S&T investments, are still the largest in the world, but China is rapidly advancing on us. But then if you add in
the next 5 or 6 allies, or whatever are all.
Yeah, they're all our allies, and that together with ours absolutely swamps the investments that China is making. So, hey, I want to switch gears a little bit. You know, your experience working on, I mentioned you worked on Air Force 2030. You by the way, you were very influential in writing that report. I know, I was there, I watched it. You were very influential in writing that report. And you brought a particularly unique perspective that was frankly refreshing. It was kind of the early career view that a bunch of us, you know, more senior folks, not allowed to say old or young, but a bunch of us more senior folks who were kind of more used to the system didn't really bring to bear. What were your lessons learned? What did you conclude after having explored the world of DoD science and engineering?
It was a fantastic opportunity to see, you know, where those other people at the table were coming from, because it's easy from an early career person in the echo chamber of, you know, my peers who are my same age and same career stage to say, yeah, it's crazy that, you know, compensation and flexibility and mobility and all these things are so much better, often true or perceived. That is for sure the perception outside of the government, outside of military labs and things like that. And like, my personal dream is to work at a national lab. I think those people do the coolest research. You know, academia is great for now, but I think that would be a very cool place to work. And it is funny hearing people who, a lot of the folks on the 2030 committees were either like former or current staff at the labs or had been warfighters who got the technology from the labs, and they were involved in that whole pipeline. And hearing that, like, I don't know, I remember saying a few things and talking to people even outside of the room about, like, where is the gap? Like, how come those people know it's so cool to work there, so meaningful? People my age, especially coming out of college, where they're telling you to go, you know, industry, computer science, engineering, a lot of those things are not. I think the government has a perception of not being that flexible. And I think it goes back to something that you've talked about in a few of your other episodes, that you don't need more acquisition mechanisms and more hiring mechanisms and all these authorities. The government just needs to be comfortable working in that flexible gray area, very limber, very quick. And I think that's one of the things that the committee, we ended up doing a good job of saying in the document, which hopefully is being used downstream, of that is important, that whether those people think there is this flexibility, it is important to folks of my career stage at this time. And, you know, you want kids to go to college, study S&T, and then go do a stint in the lab. I think one of the coolest experiences I had adjacent to 2030 was going with you to the AFOSR, Air Force Office of Scientific Research, panel review, and hearing a lot of the program officers talk about how they have their funded researchers do a stint in the lab, and have grad students funded by those researchers also go do a stint in the lab sometimes. And like that has to be the best experience, because you can see, like, you're working, you know, in the very basic, very, very basic research in the academic lab. You get to go to the Air Force lab and kind of see it start creeping up a few TRLs, and like having more of those opportunities I think would be good. Yeah, it was just interesting to hear that it's not this like random bureaucracy that's just a wall, which of course is what I always thought of it before working in a government adjacent, capacity.
Yeah. Well, there is some bureaucracy.
Well, there's a ton of bureaucracy,
right?
but it's not nameless, it's not faceless. It's each of these people who often there's a disconnect between what folks are told when they're in undergraduate or graduate programs or applying to, versus what those people live and what they have lived for the last 50 years. And I think, like, especially now where work is so flexible and folks don't stay in a job for that long, you know, most of my friends are on their third job by now. It's nice to see that you can make an impact, but also be able to transition, you know, from one lab to another, or from a basic research funded perspective into a, you know, applied research.
Yeah. So I'm obviously a really big fan of having the best and the brightest minds in the country working in, you know, our national labs. I think I share your admiration for the DoD laboratories, and I worry that, kind of along with you, that we're not doing a sufficient job of relaying what a great career path that can be. You know, the department has programs like the SMART Fellowship Program, for example, the NDSEG fellowships to try to bring people into the lab. But I love your comment about linking graduate students, say, who are funded under projects that are supported by AFOSR and, you know, that services ONR, getting them as much exposure into the lab as possible.
Yeah, because they're going to be looking for jobs. They don't want to be grad students forever. I don't want to be a grad student forever. I'm ready to start thinking about, you know, what skill set should I have, should I work on now, and what do I want to learn in my time in academia so that I can be the best contributor to a national lab or wherever else. I think the time sitting there would be really helpful. And yeah, I mean, I think folks were receptive once we talked about that a bit. I think there are a few programs in other aspects of the government that are also helpful for that. One is Intern, which is an NSF program for grad students, and you can use that money for a summer or a semester to go do anything non-academic, which includes getting to go to labs. I think that's awesome. I think you're only eligible for it if you either have the Graduate Research Fellowship or your advisor has an NSF grant. But that's a cool, you know, crossover opportunity. I think the NDSEG is just like a large PhD student fellowship with no service requirement. That's very interesting. I think that's very few students. Like, I think the NSF funds maybe 1,200 new GRFs a year, and I think the NDSEG is more close to like 200 or 300, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but NSF is a much broader range of. It's a much
no,
much
totally.
So
I just
it's actually
think
much harder
in terms
to get.
of
yeah, just for the record.
Thanks. But yeah, just from like a reach perspective, you know, even talking about it with other folks in my university and passing around the link, not a lot of folks had heard of it. I think it's even in life sciences, the NSF is like the one everyone knows to apply to when they get to grad school, and the NDSEG, you kind of need to nudge a few folks forward. The cool thing about the NDSEG fellowship is that you have to write it to one of the BAAs from ARO or the other research offices, and having to read those. Like, I read stuff like that all the time. I read Academy's report. I just like knowing who thinks what is important, especially, you know, forecasting, because my career hopefully will stretch a long time.
Yep.
I like to know where the experts think we're going.
Yeah.
And, papers, it's funny, being in academia, like an academic paper is kind of a retrospective because by the time it's published, it was done. It was started, it was done, it was reviewed, it was revised, and then it was published. Right. Even with the preprint, it's still kind of a retrospective on what somebody thought was important a year ago, at least. So reading the forecast is very interesting, but you have to, for the NDSEG grad fellowship, write your research and justify kind of how it helps one of the priorities of the funding offices and the services, which I thought was a really interesting exercise. It doesn't have to be so tight. I don't mean to make it sound restricting. It was more of like an eye-opening thing for sure, especially to see how cross-cutting the different offices are. The other area of government I also think is crazy cool, as I think a lot of people do, is DARPA. And I liked looking at their project descriptions because, that means that somebody thought those things were important. So that also interesting forecasting for where those people think the field is going.
Yeah, no, you look at the list of technologies that DARPA had a hand in developing, and you're right. They have quite an interesting portfolio, though. As I'm quick to point out, and I think you've also pointed out, it's not just DARPA. DARPA is just one, but then there are all these other great on the intelligence side, the IARPA, for example, is doing some really amazing things. Back in the department. So in addition to the labs, you've got the Strategic Capabilities Office, and the Missile Defense Agency has a basic research portfolio, and now we've got the Space Development Agency, and okay, I'm biased. They used to work for me, but I'm a big fan of all these organizations.
No bias detected,
no bias
for
there.
sure,
Yeah,
Dr.
no bias
Lewis.
there. But the scientific talent that the department has, but more importantly, the folks who are looking forward to where the investment should be, and I'm driven by the mission of supporting national defense, which is one that always kind of resonates with me. So that's great to hear. So what do you think we need to be doing better? You've kind of alluded to this, but what do you think we need to be doing better to attract the best and the brightest, the other Sara Carioscias of the world, to work on problems of interest?
I'm flattered.
There you go.
I think
don't let it go to your head, but yeah.
I will forget it immediately.
Okay.
I think that maybe just like it's tricky because on the one hand, I bring the bias that I know of a lot of these things and a lot of these places to look for funding and look for jobs. But I think that the average grad student, part of it, and my peers, most of the people I know in grad school are as smart as me, like if not obviously smarter. They're fantastic people. I just think that there's not a good branding of DoD. Like there is really interesting basic science to be done that of course has applications towards national security and maybe military applications, but also infrastructure that I think is good here. And so like, for example, the SMART Scholarship is a graduate fellowship that has a service requirement. So for each year you're funded by that, you commit to going to work at one of those offices. And it's a paid job once you transition into work, but you have to go. I think anyone who reads the Stippy review of SMART would know that there are some challenges in that program that I think could be really easily improved, because that's the DoD saying, these are the students we want to fund and we want them to have to come work for us. We are offering them a job without even knowing who they're going to be in 2 or 3 or 4 years. Yeah. You want those people to stay, so retention, of course, but also advertising. Like, I definitely didn't know, and of course, again, my blind spots, absolutely, but I, as like an average student at a good university, I didn't know that you could be a scientist in the government. I didn't know that you could be a scientist in a national lab. Those were not jobs that I was so aware of. I started applying to jobs. I applied when I was a senior to a lot of jobs, at Oak Ridge and Lawrence Livermore and other places like that in the DOE labs. But at that point, I was a senior. Like, I already had research experience. It was almost kind of like, oh, good, I could get an interview for any of these jobs. This would be good. It's not quite as obvious that there are non-military civilian science basic research jobs in outside of schools that get a lot of military funding, I think is kind of the big thing. I imagine at a school where a lot of the faculty are funded by the DoD, of course, that's part of the culture. That your undergraduate research is funded by that. But yeah, I think a little bit of advertising in a cool way. Yeah. In a good way. Like some of I remember hearing at the AFOSR review panel, like some of the research they were doing, I was like, oh, if I knew anything about electronics, that'd be the coolest thing. If I knew anything about whatever, that would be the coolest thing. And it's not all technology for military necessarily. Of course, you're taking money from the DoD, but Yeah, I think a bit of a branding thing would help a lot.
Yeah, you're right. I kind of agree with you there.
And then also, sorry, back to the Air Force 2030 strategy thing. I think the perception that there isn't a lot of flexibility, like each, just to speak about the Air Force labs, I think there are specialties at each of them, and so you want to be at a place where people do the research that you want to be doing. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense. But you also want to know that you can have a career there, or you will be so well prepared for another career that people obviously want to hire you. And I almost feel like that clout isn't perceived, whereas everybody, kind of an analog, I guess. An analog is that in our undergraduate business school at Georgetown, everybody knows if you work at Goldman for a few years, your career is good to go. You'll be sought after for any kind of job you want in the medium term. And I think that for me, I feel like I would be really well served by having a next job in a lab, because I feel like that would give me a very exciting and applicable and interesting skill set. But I don't know that perception is widely held.
So yeah, I can agree with you. I having been inside the Pentagon and been on a university campus, I'm not sure we always do a particularly good job of making it clear the opportunities. I would argue that, especially for an early career scientist, some of the lab jobs are not only amazing opportunities because the resources, but the amount of responsibility that the government will give to an early career scientist or engineer compared to what they might be getting in some other venue. I think it's absolutely amazing. Now, in an academic environment, and this one I'm kind of asking this question with my own mindset, having been on a university campus for many years. There tends to be this sense in academia that the most exalted position you can have when you finish your PhD is an academic position. And I'm wondering, have you encountered that at all? And when do you tell your colleagues, your peers, hey, I'm thinking a good career would be at a DoD lab or Department of Energy lab or NIH?
Funny that we go there. I think there's a few sides to that. One is that I never held that illusion, I guess, just because I worked government adjacent first before being in a real university as a graduate student. So I know that there are extremely cool jobs elsewhere. I think it is a little bit taboo to say sometimes, especially in funding statements. Yeah. So hopefully I don't have to apply for any grants, and anyone who's listening is going to say, this girl does not want to be a faculty. I know that. Yeah. But that's definitely culture. I think Hopkins and some other grad schools that I visited are doing a much better job of sharing career information in general. We have a really strong career office for graduate students at Johns Hopkins that brings across, and we always get surveys like, do you want to learn more about government, national lab? I've added national labs to this list as an other very frequently, but government, consulting, industry, pharma, the whole nine. And a lot of folks have transitioned into jobs there from interviews and information sessions that were conducted on campus or lately on Zoom, specifically for Hopkins. So I think that's a real strength that I know that they've been working very hard on since I started, and I'm really happy to be seeing it be fruitful for my colleagues. But yeah, there is a little bit of that perception, and I think it's exacerbated while you're a graduate student. I know that if I send an email, it'll get a different response than if my advisor copy and pasted that exact email. And I'm grateful that he would do that for me, but also I think that we're asking for the same thing. But then you see, for your whole time, 4 or 5 or 6 years as a graduate student, you see that I am at the lowest totem pole. The people who get what they want are faculty, so therefore I want to be a faculty. And the other, pulling behind the curtain is that a lot of faculty still do research, and, I'm fortunate that my advisor is very much involved in a lot of the research in our lab, and he knows what's going on, and it's so helpful to bounce ideas off of him because he knows. But of course you can tell that a lot of their job is not just research. They have to manage all of us, they have to apply for grants, all that stuff. And kind of I like the science, but I don't know. It's nice to have the other options introduced, but I think the culture is behind the options. I could go to 2 Zoom events a week, interviews, small groups with people who work in these jobs. At the end of the day, the subculture is you want to be a faculty. Yes. And the statistics are not that, and also, the opportunities, I think. I'm happy again that a lot of the faculty in my department seem like they have their dream job, and I really hope that's true because a lot of the faculty are fantastic. But that's not my dream job, and it is funny when you're applying for grants and stuff. Even when I was applying for the NSF, I was like, can I say that I think I can apply this to a career in a national lab or in government, or is that going to be the thing that makes me not get it, or one of the things? So it is a tricky line for sure. And it's still, you should run it by someone before you say you want another job.
So, you know, it's funny, when you and I were at STIPI, I would often be asked to give talks about alternate careers to academia for graduate students. And I would say, wait a minute, let's do the numbers. All right, maybe if you're lucky, 5% of your PhD students will actually wind up with successful faculty careers. So we're not the alternate. You
Correct.
are.
Exactly.
Yeah, you know, it's like they're much more likely to be in industry. They're much more likely to be in a government lab than they are to, you know, to become a faculty member.
And that is one of the exciting things, I think. Like, my advisor is a junior faculty, and so I think he's probably seen more of his colleagues go not into academia, which is awesome, because I mentioned him the other day, something like random that I was interested in. He immediately was like, oh, I know a few people. We can talk to them. That'd be awesome. That'd be a lot of fun for you. Yeah. You know, I have their emails, whatever. I'm like, oh, his network is so rich, which is fantastic, because he probably has this like good mindset of, at most 5% of my PhD students over my career are going to be faculty, so it's probably not going to be this one statistically,
right.
Statistically, let alone practically. So that's awesome, and I think the culture is changing with the newer folks. It's funny to like also try to put a pulse on whether folks in my department think they want to be academic faculty, because I think part of it is the prestige and the numbers together make people feel shy to say that they want to, because it's like, it's the same thing, like, oh, I thought I could get into Johns Hopkins, like, oh, I think I can be a faculty. But on the flip side, it's also a little bit taboo not to say it. So you don't know, I never know who really means it. I could read 100 grants and not know. It's more of a problem for some graduate student grants than for others.
So as we wrap up, let me ask you the question, which is, so what advice do you have for other early career scientists, or maybe folk, you know, high school students, even early college graduates who are contemplating the possibility of a career in STEM, and maybe a career in STEM that has relevance to the Department of Defense?
I think that no matter who you talk to, first off, I think the number one advice is talk to as many people as you can. I think people are very generous with their time, especially for folks interested in things that are important to them. So if you email me telling me you're interested broadly in any part of science policy, science communication, biology, genomics, what have you, you know, you're hitting my heartstrings. So of course I want to talk to you. Of course I want to foster that. I think, the closer you are to someone's interest, probably, you know, it's a heat map and they're like more interested in talking to you also. But I think the other important thing to remember is that everyone who's anywhere probably benefited from those talks themselves. And I got a lot of informational interviews, a lot of coffee chats. And I do those coffee chats now with other people. And they always leave me feeling pretty excited because, you know, I talked to a high school kid a few weeks ago. Maybe she was like 16 and she mentioned something. I was like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's really neat. She's, you know, however much younger than me, and she's not even as jaded as me, and I think I'm pretty unjaded, so that was very good. So, you know, those people get stuff from your conversations too, and of course they want to support the pipeline that benefited them for so long. So I think talking to as many people as you can, it's going to feel weird at first. Like for me, it feels like I have nothing to offer still sometimes when I ask people for, you know, help or to chat. But I think there is a culture of paying it forward. So, you know, I try to say something like, oh, I can't wait till I can talk to someone about this. It's not going to be you because you're talking to me about it today, and I still don't know, clearly, because we're talking about it. But at some point, I think those informational chats are important. I think the other really big barrier that a lot of places are working on, it's very much in like the science discourse, is writing stuff like, oh, for graduate school, you need a first author publication, or, oh, for graduate school, you needed to have a 4.0, you need to have years of research experience. Like, those are all bars. You know, people can hit those differently. The unpaid gigs, all this stuff is like very inequitable. But I think a lot of places are doing a little bit better of a job of like not advertising that gatekeeping and rather saying like, we are interested in folks who have the capacity to learn and are very interested and willing to put in the time. And if you like, I showed up to grad school and it was my very first time taking all of the core courses except one. I think we took like 6 courses and I had not taken any of them except one. And that wasn't even my best class at the end of it. But I guess, you know, I was just excited to learn it, and fortunately they looked at my transcript and they were like, I guess it'll be okay. And it was totally fine. And I know it now, and I'm glad I took the classes, but I imagine years ago it would have been in like a 1-to-1, and like you get like a little X if it's not on your transcript. So good thing. I think don't undersell, you know, like you read a job application or grad school application and they say, we only want the best and brightest. And those are all code words. Those are all code words for them to tell themselves that they have the best and brightest. Like, you are extremely best and extremely bright if you're willing to try really hard and put in the time and stuff. So don't read something and not call. Don't read something and not apply. Let them tell you. Don't tell yourself that you couldn't have that opportunity. But talking to people was the thing that I found singularly the most helpful, for sure.
Very good advice indeed. Sarah, I could talk to you all day.
Me too.
But alas, our time is coming in. Let me just say that anytime I worry about the future of the United States S&T enterprise, talking to you alleviates any concern that I have. As long as this nation has young scientists and engineers with your intelligence and enthusiasm, we're in great shape. So thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait to see what you wind up doing. It's going to be phenomenal.
Thanks, Dr. Lewis. I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on the show. It was awesome.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.